Good evening, and welcome back to another episode of Please Call Me Crazy, brought to you by Free People Radio. I am your host, Royce White, and I am here at Free People Radio in the belly of the beast, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today, we have another incredible family and friends episode. Our guest is none other than the great Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is considered to be one of the most brilliant political minds in the world. His opponents and detractors would say he is one of the most dangerous political minds in the world. But as a comrade, a friend, and a mentor in this fight for freedom, I consider him to be one of the most genuine political minds in the world. Without any further ado, I bring to you the great Steve Bannon. Thanks for being here today, Steve. I really appreciate it. It's actually an honor. I want to say welcome back to YouTube, first of all. I know I've seen you on YouTube, a few different shows. They've allowed you to guest on a few different podcasts, Tim Pool and Jason Whitlock and some others, and leave you up there. And I say that because it was your work in the earliest days of War Room Pandemic that is now one of the most downloaded podcasts all around the world that drove me to reach out to our mutual friend, Jeff Quatnitz, and get a hold of you. And the rest is history. So it's an honor. Honest to God, it is a real honor to be able to have you with us on the show in the earliest days and infancy of this podcast. Please call me crazy. Nay, I say you were one of the premier voices in my ear, telling me to get a podcast going and get on the horse with putting content out there. So I appreciate your time today.
Well, not just that, I think we live stream all the on Getter, our Getter accounts. We live stream your podcast. It's a huge hit. With
I want to say thank you for that, for sure. The Getter audience loves the Bannon White connection. We may have to do some more in studio work there. Maybe I get a satellite office out there in DC and we can do some special work together. But yeah, I want to start off today. I mean, I know we have huge news coming out of the financial sector, the bank there in Silicon Valley, and many other pressing geopolitical matters. And I know we would be remiss for this audience that loves the deep dive, they love the deep insight, they love the history, they love the nuance. We'd be remiss not to touch on a wide variety of political topics. But what I always like to do with my guests, for the record, because we are in times where history is going to become ever important. I saw an interview of you with PBS Frontline. It was one of the most powerful interviews I think I've ever seen in my life, and definitely was in your favor in terms of how the mainstream media would like to portray you or portray the working man, any working man, and how you came across. If you could, just to get us started, take us back to growing up there in Northern Virginia. Just briefly, take us back to growing up there in Northern Virginia in a working class family or from a working class family in a working class town, and how the legacy of the great Marty Bannon shaped your worldview, and bring us up to, about college or the area where you became a man, growing up as a young kid in North Virginia to becoming a man.
well, I was born in Norfolk, near the Navy base down there, and pretty rapidly moved to Washington with my dad, who was essentially a blue collar worker, had just come up to the highest of the blue collar, lowest of the white collar, and then went to Richmond, which is really Central Virginia. We were in Northern Virginia, or really D.C., for about a year, and then when I was, I don't know, 2 or 3 years old, went back to went to Richmond, where I was really raised. And it's just a classic, you know, Irish Catholic, working class family. 5 kids, a mom who was a homemaker. My dad essentially could support the entire family off a working man's wage, one wage earner, with the benefits at the phone company. And he was a company man. His father, in fact, somebody told me one time, I think they may be the only two. His dad worked 50 years for the phone company, and my father worked 50 years for the phone company. So these were, and the family was that were not firemen or policemen, were or in the Navy, or the supported the base in Norfolk, which at the time was, and I still think, the largest naval base in the world, were with the telephone company. And so, it's just a kind of classic American, Irish Catholic family, that the whole life was around the church and around the family and around the company, around the work. So I was raised and went to a Catholic school, Benedictine nuns taught me in grammar school, and I went to a military prep school run by the Benedictine monks in Richmond, and then went to college with about 20 guys from my class, which was an engineering school, principally an engineering school. I was in the College of Architecture, in kind of the planning. I got a degree in environmental urban systems, and then I was always going to go in the Navy. One of the reasons I didn't want to go to the service academies, I knew I was going to go in the service afterwards and want to have a little time as a civilian. So went into the service, and then spent 4 years at sea, 3 years back in the Pentagon as the special assistant, one of the special assistants to the chief of naval operations, and got a master's at Georgetown in national security policy. At the time, learned both my time in the Pentagon and my time at Georgetown was amazing because I learned from the best people in the world at Georgetown. It was a program I think Gene Kirkpatrick had started on national security studies, and given that my entire military experience was in Asia or the Middle East, I was in the destroyer that was part of the Pacific Fleet, but really part of the historic Seventh Fleet that won the war against the Imperial Japanese. And so we were in the South China Sea, Taiwan, all the places are hot spots today. East China Sea, I was there as a young man in my early 20s, and then to the Persian Gulf, off of Iran during the hostage crisis back, I think, in 1979, 1980. So, and I came to the Pentagon the first day of the Reagan administration, saw at a very senior level what the war plans were, had the beginning of the takedown of the Soviet Union. So I was blessed, went to Harvard Business School, and then went to Wall Street, became a financier.
Yeah.
So just it's very typical American family that put, blue collar family that put family first and the achievements of the family first, and really based everything on education. And you had to get an education if you wanted to get out of the kind of the Irish ghetto, right? The glass ceiling that the Irish always put on themselves. You got to get an education. I always prided myself of going to what I knew early on is I wanted to compete at the highest levels against the best and the brightest. And that's whether Georgetown or the Pentagon or Wall Street or Goldman Sachs or Harvard, just get in there and compete with the best and mix it up and see how you match up.
And you were somebody, and I always find that the mainstream media is most afraid of guys who saw the mainstream machine from the inside, right? And that's kind of their angst or their sort of urgency, their scare around a person like Kerry Lake, who spent time in the newsroom, who spent time inside the media industrial complex, knows how it works, knows the gears, knows how to push back, knows the line of questioning, the way they corrupt the narrative. You're also one of those guys who spent time inside the machine, whether it was, you had some work there or some business in Hollywood, and I know that you had some great business ventures there in the media world, but also working at Goldman and Sachs on Wall Street. What were the things that you saw during your time in working in media or working there on Wall Street that sort of preempted your what would I say, your populist, your nationalist populist leadership today? What were those red flags that you witnessed coming through those machines?
Well, this is why I'm not conspiracy theorists who don't believe in conspiracy, the Illuminati and the Bilderberg group and all that, which do have elements of it, but it's not the way the system works. And I was blessed by both the Pentagon, first of all, deployed with the American fleet, where it really is the extension of American power throughout the world, particularly in the Middle East and in Asia. And then coming back to the Pentagon and seeing it at the highest levels, right, with the section I was in, to see it at the highest levels. Then HBS, Harvard, and then to go to Goldman Sachs in the merger department, where I think I was the 25th or 26th guy hired in the renowned merger and acquisition department of Goldman. I then had the opportunity to work throughout Europe and Asia. I had my own firm, whether it was Hong Kong, Paris. So I did a partnership with a French bank, Societe Generale. So I got over a 20 or 30-year period to be able to see at the highest levels in the rooms where the decisions are made, whether that's decisions of war and peace, national security, whether it's in finance, Hollywood, the same thing when I started my firm out in Hollywood. And the one thing that I want everybody to understand is that, the two smartest guys I've ever met in my life are my grandfather and my dad. And my grandfather went to the third grade, right, and was basically a lineman, a foreman, a PBX man, what they call at the phone company. And my dad essentially had a high school degree, and they're the smartest people. The one thing I learned from being in those rooms where decisions are made, that working class people and my aunts and uncles and my parents and everybody I knew were every bit as smart and probably had more common sense then these elites I worked with. And when I was in Europe with Paris, at SocGen, and in Paris and in London, where I'd lived in both kind of for a while, doing a lot of deals in Europe with Hambros Bank, which we bought, SocGen bought, and I was kind of one of the guys there when they originally bought it. So saw all the English elite. Is that the working class people in the United States got pretty good common sense, and these people, and particularly when I met all the aristos, what they call the aristos, or what I call Eurotrash, all the aristocratic families who are all kind of deadbeats. It's There's nothing there. I mean, it's the American, and by the way, working people throughout the world, we all have a common base. But the American experience is so unique, and with all the things we've been through, of slavery and civil rights and all that, and this kind of melting pot of everybody. There's something unique about American working class people and middle class people that they just kind of understand, and they have a great common sense to them, and a great grit and determination and heart. And that's incredibly unique of everywhere I've thought in the world. And I really became to kind of question the elites, because I saw it up close and personal, that they're not that smart, and they're really detached from reality, just the lifestyle. And it's not that they're bad people. There are bad people in the world, like George Soros, but it's a system. It's a system that detaches you, because most of these people come in the global elites, outside of the super wealthy. A lot of these come from working class and middle class
No
families,
doubt.
but they get caught up in the system. I mean, Royce, you've seen this in sports, and particularly the sports media business. They get caught up in what it takes in the system to get ahead and thrive, and the system takes over. And so that's one thing. I've always been a kind of a populist, because I just believed in the roots and the decency and the hard work and the common sense of my own family, and really the leaders of my family, which were, the strong women in our family that always had a point of view, but particularly the guys like my dad and my grandfather.
And you that's what I would call moral hazard, and the moral hazard of this global corporatocracy type of culture, mentality, crony capitalism, and then you got these other ideologies that are mixing in there now, and we got a melting pot of what you would call unrighteous ambition is really what's at the helm in our elite, in our political elite class, and our economic elites, in large parts, certainly the academic elites. Moral hazard, cultural moral hazard. But one of the reasons that I believe that the system is so hell-bent on taking you out, they call you one of the most dangerous political minds in the world. I started off the show by saying I just see a guy who's one of the most genuine political minds in the world, but you and I are obviously cut from the same cloth. But one of the things that you were very, very vocal about, and have been vocal about and adamant on focusing on and disseminating a message to the common man about, is how this financial Ponzi scheme works, right? The Federal Reserve and the guys on Wall Street in the 2009 financial crisis. And we had Dr. Chris Martenson come on the show in a previous Family Friends episode, and he talked about the transition from fractional reserve banking to the sweep system, and this whole sort of financial Ponzi scheme that's taken place right under the nose of the common working man in this country. Take me through that. Take me through not Goldman Sachs, but the 2009 financial crisis as you see it, how it unfolded, and where the decisions were made and where they could have possibly been made to put us in a better direction.
It's obviously it was a combination of kind of the administrative state or big government, but really also driven, which the Republicans wanted to hide for years, of corporatist banking. And you had this financial crisis based on mortgage-backed securities. But basically what you had is a system where people wanted to get higher returns, right, that really weren't going to come from just letting people look at these securities. So they kind of bundled these things. And then you had this massive meltdown of these investment banks that really weren't regulated properly, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. And what happened is that Lehman Brothers was the center of the commercial paper market. And the smartest guys in the world, when they finally said, we can't take any more moral hazard by bailing guys out. We have to let this fall. What they didn't realize, the smartest guys in the room, that Lehman Brothers is at the center of the system that really lets the GEs of the world and everybody have cash overnight and really be able to make payroll or be able to buy food for this cafeteria. They all go in this commercial paper market that rolls over 24 hours a day. They didn't realize that. And you think about it, they're so smart. How'd they miss that? When Lehman cratered, it created hard. And after a couple of days after it went into bankruptcy, I think 3 or 4 days, they went over to see Bush, because this is right in the middle of the 2008 election. This was the second week of September, of which Sarah Palin and John McCain, I think, were 1 point up on Barack Obama. Right. This is after he had the issue with his the Christian preacher. He was part of his
Jeremiah
church.
Wright.
There was Jeremiah Wright. There was some controversy, and Obama had been way ahead, but now it was a tight race. And what they did is they went in to see Bush and said, hey, look, and this is a guy I used to work for at Goldman Sachs, Hank Paulson, who was Secretary of the Treasury, and Ben Bernanke, head of the Federal Reserve. These guys go in the Oval Office and say, hey, look, this thing, we didn't really realize that this was centerpiece, and this is starting to crater, and we need $1 trillion. Back in that day, an unbelievable amount of money, $1 trillion, and we need it by 5 o'clock, or the American financial system is going to collapse in basically 24 to 48 hours. And the world financial system may collapse in 72 hours, and we could have global chaos. And Bush goes, well, I don't have the authority. You got to go see Nancy Pelosi. And then that lit the fuse in the Oval Office, I think on the 17th of September in 2008. That lit the fuse that went off on Donald Trump's presidency, because every time you've had a financial crisis in world history, you've had a populist reaction to that, because the people are about to get screwed in a big way, both from the collapse of the system and how that they rejuvenate the system, which is always on the back of the working class, which was here. What happened, and think about, and what got me thinking, I said, in the 20th century, we fought some of the greatest bad guys in history, Tojo and Hitler and Mussolini and the Soviets. And I mean, we fought a who's who of bad hombres, and not one of them came close to doing what we had done ourselves. None of them had come close to collapsing the American financial system. None of them come close to having the American financial system collapse and take down the world financial system. No way. Germany didn't come close to it. The Bolsheviks didn't come close to it.
The enemy within.
Enemy within. And I said, how did this happen? And so, and that led, and that's, it was a life-changing moment for me. I'd kind of, at the time, was segueing out of politics to look at being a filmmaker. I made one film. I had made a film in years because I couldn't find a topic. And I said, since I understand this from my HBS, my Harvard background, and my financial experience at Goldman in my own firm, I understand this. I got to jump into it. And so that led the whole thing of me getting really involved in meeting Andrew Breitbart, doing a bunch of films about this, really becoming part of the Tea Party movement. And then being ready when Donald Trump kind of came on the scene, this populist nationalist movement. But, and you don't think we're out of it. The same, we've never solved the problem. Remember, President Obama came in, and what led up to that was not his fault. He came in and won a couple of weeks later by a big number.
Right. He took over. He took over a problem.
He took over a problem. But Biden and those guys were part of the problem.
They were there the whole time.
But here's the thing that's so funny is that he's presented as the most progressive politician in American history. But if you look at it, there's a great book called Confidence Men, I think it was, that talked about the inner workings of the first 2 years of Obama. And Obama was a constitutional law professor. He's a brilliant guy, but his line of work is constitutional law. He's not a finance guy. He's not a guy from Wall Street. And he had a fairly rudimentary, like Jack Kennedy had, like the Bushes had, like Ronald Reagan had. They had a very rudimentary knowledge of how the American economy works, particularly the capital markets. And he essentially turned it over to people that he brought in. And their solution was to save the system. And they were, at that moment, it was about saving the system. The crisis of the early year, the first year of President Obama's term in office, administration, was the system was in a free fall and about to collapse. And they came up with a solution, which was to take the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, which we had never done before, and actually have the Federal Reserve essentially print money. And that money would be infused into the system to push up assets, real estate assets and stocks and bonds. And we would save the system by doing that. And in the minutes of the Federal Reserve, there's guys like Dick Fisher, these presidents of these Federal Reserves, a lot of guys are and take interest rates to zero and sometimes negative interest rate. Basically, infuse the system immediately with cash. It'd be like this, for instance, if in your own life, if all of a sudden you had a credit card problem and you were broke, you had no cash, you got laid off and you were cash, and a friend came over or a family member and said, hey, I'm going to give you a couple $1,000. I'm going to fuse your system with cash, with liquidity, so you can start paying off stuff and you can survive. Yeah. That's in a macro sense what we did. And Obama, the most progressive president on what I call the foreground of the pro wrestling of politics, was actually the most reactionary politician as far as the economy goes. And what they did in the minutes and the arguments of people saying, hey, if we do this, we're going to screw the working class and the middle class, because it's all going to be on their shoulders. They're going to pay for all the bailouts. They're going to pay all the taxes for the bailouts. And with negative interest rates, their checkbooks aren't going to make any money. Their savings account won't make any money. Their money markets will make it. They'll never have any ability to have any other type of capital accumulation in this. But the wealthy are going to make out like nobody's business. And what you had is the greatest, over his 8 years, was the greatest concentration of wealth in American history up to the pandemic.
And so you had, so you had a progressive narrative, a progressive movement that was waged to get President Barack Obama elected, which basically said all of these different marginalized and oppressed groups, specifically black people, specifically black history, is going to be remedied and solved by us electing this president, in effect. And what they did, but what they did in actuality was they used the federal government as a battle axe to forward a policy that would take money away from generations of working class.
Let me just differ one thing, because I think it's very illustrative or emblematic of what I want the point I make. When that came after Obama was in. If you look at the way Obama ran as and I've studied his primary campaign against Hillary Clinton very closely, because I used many of the same techniques to defeat her with Donald Trump. Barack Obama didn't run as that. Barack Obama came forward, and he didn't really make race an issue. It was Jeremiah Wright and Hannity, these guys who tried to do it later. He came forward as an anti-war populist. He took on the same system that Donald Trump took on. And his early speeches are a total fire breather. He wanted to get out of the wars. He was really against the administrative state. Barack Obama presented himself and defeated Hillary Clinton, of which Bernie Sanders never did, because Barack Obama presented himself as someone that was going to stand against the neoliberal, neocon world order, which we see collapsing now, since he started running in 2006, basically 16 years after he first really came on the scene, okay? Barack Obama in the primary, and Barack Obama took it to Hillary Clinton all the time on this very topic. Something Bernie Sanders had 2 shots, and this is when people come, Bernie said, Bernie Sanders is a wimp. Barack Obama brought the heat. Barack Obama didn't really run, I didn't think, as a progressive. He didn't. That's what so many whites, I think, came to him.
Around him. They built that on him. They built it on his back as a convenient thing to do yeah.
Exactly. But he ran as an anti-war populist, taking on neoliberal, neocon. Now, when he steps into office, he's actually presented with, okay, brother, you talk big, the neoliberal order is collapsing immediately, and you're going to get blamed unless you bail us out. They go to a neoliberal reactionary system. That's why I think so much of what I call the window dressing, the pro wrestling, was Obama doing all these things afterwards, but the core, and he also got sucked into supporting the neocon order. To me, Barack Obama as a political figure, quite frankly, is a tragic political figure. What he represented at its core essence, I realize people say I'm insane, is not that different. It's different in degree, but not in kind, of what Donald Trump actually ran on, which is to confront the neoliberal, neoconservative order. And we did, obviously, as right-wingers. Obama did it as center-left. But the tragedy of Barack Obama, given what was happening in the collapse of that order, where you wouldn't have any orderly transition, and you would have to have balls of titanium to do this, because a lot of people at the time said, just let it, like we're having the conversations today. Do you go in and seize Silicon Valley Bank and stop the contagion? And you're going to have to bail it out. And you may have to bail out some rich people. You may have to bail out, because if you don't, the contagion's going to spread. Obama was basically presented with a thing in the defining moment, that if you don't step in here and step in the most massive way that's ever come in American history, the system will collapse around you. And of course, you'll be the black president. You'll be the black Hoover, right? Because they won't remember that Bush brought this on. They're going to remember that you were there just like they didn't remember Harding and Calvin Coolidge and the other guys that had the Roaring Twenties that helped bring it on. They just remember Hoover, right? So Barack Obama, to me, politically, is a tragic figure. He ran as an anti-war populist. He ran as somebody's going to take on the neoliberal neocon order, and because of the events of the time, he ended up actually being the biggest proponent of this. He was the savior of the neoliberal order, at least for a moment in time, and it led to the greatest concentration of wealth, something he would have never envisioned, and quite frankly, have fought. And not just that, he also got sucked in. He wanted to get out of these wars.
Yeah, no doubt.
Look,
I remember clearly.
My first year, I can tell you, getting out of Afghanistan, I lost that battle in the first year. And President Trump had me when Trump wanted out, and he had me as his dog. And I'm pretty tough. I had some big wins in the White House. I got steamrolled on this. The system wouldn't have it. Obama got it.
Well, wait, stop. Don't.
Yeah.
The system wouldn't have. Well, first, let me stop. We're gonna come back to. We're gonna talk about the nature of our national security and these forever wars for sure, because that's where I think you're probably the most intelligent person that we can listen to today. But before we get there, can we please for me from your and I'm genuinely interested. This isn't just a fluff interview question. How you're somebody who comes from a more working class, what we would consider traditional liberal town upbringing. I mean, you got Catholicism, you got Irish Catholics, so you tilt a little more conservative, but just in general, the political is more traditional liberal, would you say, right?
We were all Democrats until Reagan. I mean, we walked. My older brother says he don't want to hear about Democrats today because he walked the precinct twice. For Adlai Stevenson, both times. So no, we were working. Kennedy was like the guy, he was a godhead. He was a godlike figure. We were working class Democrats until the Vietnam War and the end of the Vietnam War and how it came down. Yeah, so we come from a center left, traditionally conservative family, but the politics were Kennedy Democrats.
And I always say that I'm further right than you, and people laugh at that, and they some people laugh, some people think that I'm just shilling or covering for you, but I actually am genuinely further right than you are. But tell me how you've seen the progression or this Overton window shift of where the sort of center was traditionally in respect to, you talked about it with Obama in some respect, but then really with Donald Trump. I mean, it's from my vantage point, it's all based around this economic scam. I mean, they've basically taken cultural politics and placed them out front. That's what you would call the WWE window dressing of politics, while this financial Ponzi scheme happens in the back. Is that the sole source, you would say, of the Overton window shift of what, used to be considered the center? And
over time, because remember, we've had, except for a couple of years in the Trump administration, we've really had no economic growth. And the working people, it's all predicated on their shoulders. Like I said, I don't think there's been a financial crisis in history, except for maybe Japan, which has a different society, that hasn't it hasn't responded with a populist uprising,
populist revolt.
Populist revolt. And we've been very similar. Like I tell people, the fuse that was lit on September 17th or September 18th of 2008, right there in the Oval Office at the Resolute desk in Bush, that bomb went off on November 8th of 2016, or the early mornings of November 9th, where, interesting enough, just like Obama had beaten her in the primary, Donald Trump was there to beat Hillary Clinton, who's really the Clintons are the absolute Praetorian Guard and what they stand for the neoliberal neocon order. And so what went off it was there with Bush on the guy that had beaten, he took over the guy that beat her, came 8 years later with Trump. Now with Trump, remember, when we took the oath of office, there had been basically $880 billion on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve on the day of that day of the meltdown in the White House in September 2008. When Trump took office, the oath of office on the 20th of January 2017, it was $4.5 trillion. Those trillions of dollars, unheralded in American history, had been infused into the system to basically prop up asset classes and lead to the consolidation of wealth. That's what we were handed. And quite frankly, I'm very proud of the fact that, through economic, and I didn't support all the tax cuts and all the economic plan, but enough of it that in 2019, by Christmas of 2019, Trump had taken $1 trillion. Nobody gives him credit. He had taken $1 trillion out of the system,
Haircut.
right? He had haircut. He had done a quantitative tightening,
Mm-hmm.
not easing, to let the asset bubble start to deflate before he had a problem.
Well, he's a
Plus
business
that
guy. He understands the deal of it, and that the art of the deal is his calling card.
art
Yeah.
deal. And he's a blue collar.
Yeah.
I mean, he relates to Game of Queens. And all his stuff's been, the hotels are for people, and the TV shows, the Apprentice, the book.
Customer service.
Yeah, hospitality, and he knows the customer. And remember, in December, the fourth quarter of 2019 had the greatest increase for working class people because we had zero inflation. You had, I think, 11% increases in pay. It was unbelievable. Low unemployment, real wage increases. Things were on fire, and then you got hit with the CCP virus, right? But those 3 years, and I keep telling people, and you're going to see it here now, Royce, because we're in the beginning stages. This is just like the 1930s. You have a financial collapse in the late 20s after the First World War. The hysteria, the energy and stimulus after the war. It goes for about 10 years. It collapses in 29 globally. It starts to impact Europe really in the United States. Really gets impacted in the early 1930s. You have the rise of the fascist dictatorships because the capital markets crisis doesn't end. Roosevelt comes in. Some central banks do some stuff that kind of helps out for a few years, but by 1937, 38, you're back into it again, and you get into a global kinetic war. And that's exactly where we're headed now. This is, I've said on the show, is that an economic crisis caused by 2008, but then exacerbated by the pandemic when you had not solved the original sins of 2008, exacerbates that economic crisis. The drop in aggregate demand and the supply chain problem leads to a capital markets crisis, and that capital markets crisis will always lead to a geopolitical crisis. And so now we are in the early stages of the kinetic part of the Third World War. And what I'm warning people is that, in my study of history, that the convergence of the military and geopolitical crisis merging with the capital markets and the financial crisis, once they converge and conflate, it's all bets off. It's the law of unintended consequences. We have no earthly idea how this will turn out. We have, and quite quickly, it's beyond something that Americans are very, it's in the soul of our being, that America can kind of control things.
Right.
That at the end of the day, that the adults in the room in the United States of America, we can control things. Well, now you're going to see very quickly we can't, because we don't have the balance sheet that we used to have. We don't have the manufacturing base that we used to have.
The boomers believe that the jump ball will always go our way.
Exactly. Well, the boomers and all the way through American history, although people before the boomers did it with the hard experience of reality. I think the boomers, and look, I'm a boomer, but it's been the most destructive generation in the history of our country. Just got to be blunt. That's why this is a generational thing. It's why it's a fourth turning. But I will tell people now, it is accelerating at an accelerating pace, and we are very dangerous times.
And you're somebody who they regard, and this is another. I mean, your understanding of the financial Ponzi scheme and the economic tyranny that's taken place over the course of the last 10 to 20 years, or even throughout the history of America, is one reason why they really want to take you out. But the other prominent reason is your understanding of our relationship with China and the rise of China, and how our economic elites, both in D.C. and on Wall Street, aided the economic and now military and general geopolitical rise of China. Speak to a little bit about where you see the China issue effectively, where it sort of began, and where we are now there in the South China Sea, seeing as you actually served in the Navy in that area. You're an expert on that as well. Give our view, because look, when I talk to black people, and I don't, this is not a race thing, but let's be honest, if black and Hispanic men do not start to vote for this country and in effect vote for themselves and their own interests, both individually and family-wise, we may never save this nation. That's just a fact, because everybody else seems to be glued to their television. When I talk to black people, they have no concept of China. They have no concept. They think of China as a place far, far away that has no real consequence on their daily life. And if you bring up a human crisis like a human rights crisis like the Uyghurs, they say, hey, that's their fight over there, and I understand that, but injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. That was MLK. Talk about the fundamental issue of China for the working man.
Let me use an example. I'll go back to history. Let's take George Floyd. If you look at George Floyd's life was impacted and controlled, I don't think as much by racism as by the rise of China and our elites profiting for that. Remember, George Floyd came over thinking what should have happened to him at the end, he should have been up on his lake house, closing up his his house on the lake for the summer, over or opening it for Memorial Day. That coming from a good paying job at a manufacturing company where he was making wages and had benefits that could support a family. When Mr. Floyd died and they did the autopsy on his body, I think he was full of fentanyl. He had COVID-19. He had other things that come directly from the CCP. The poison of the Chinese Communist Party was in his body.
Literally,
right?
He literally died within his body.
In his body. They did the thing. I think he had some fentanyl. He had some other drug that was coming from
China. He was COVID positive.
He is COVID positive. He had in his body the poison that's come to us from the Chinese Communist Party. He also never really had a shot in life to have a good paying manufacturing job. When I was a kid, I was raised in what became a black neighborhood. And most of the people at the time in those days had pretty solid jobs in manufacturing around Richmond. All those jobs are gone now. They've all moved. The furniture industry, the textile industry, all those things have gone to China. So you don't have those jobs today. George Floyd's life, in his circumstance and predicament. Oh, by the way, the $20 bill, also the fake $20 bill, also comes, in all likelihood, comes from China, trying to put phony currency into the U.S. system. So the entire arc of his life is directly impacted by the Chinese Communist Party and the elite's ability to partner with them. Let's go back in time, and let's go back to 1989. From 1914, really the beginning of World War I, to 1989, we call it the short 20th century. That was a global war that killed about 250 million people, fighting the democracies of the Judeo-Christian West, generally against the totalitarian governments of Japan and Germany and other fascists and the Bolsheviks, and eventually Mao Zedong, because we kind of left our allies, the Russian people and the Chinese people, after World War I, who took all the casualties, essentially 95% of the casualties. We let them be controlled by their slave masters, the Bolsheviks and Mao Zedong. You come to 1989, and both of those systems are collapsing. People forget that within about a 4 or 5 month period, Royce, you had Tiananmen Square and you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, all within 1 year. That whole system comes to collapse. And what happened is Bush, as president, sends over Scowcroft to Deng Xiaoping, and here you have not just tens of thousands of people in Tiananmen Square and Lady Liberty, but you have throughout China young people saying, we don't want to live like this anymore. We can't take this brutal dictatorial power. We don't care about the economic freedom. We want to live free. And we go over and make a deal with them and say, Deng, you got to have a little bit of easing, but we'll have your back, and we'll let you in the World Trade Organization. We'll let you all in. And that's the beginning of the 21st century, really started there, where the American elites saw a way to have slave labor essentially in China to ship all the manufacturing jobs, basically the world's manufacturing, turn it over to the Chinese Communist Party and do it with slave labor that these people would never really make. They make $1 a day or $1 a month, right? And that was all not a conspiracy. That was kind of the Wall Street model and the government model. Let them in World Trade Organization, give them most favored nation status. The Chinese economy at the time was under $1 trillion. It was a nothing burger, okay? But we saw the ability of that mass of labor that quite frankly, the capitalists in the West with the Chinese Communist Party as their partner could exploit. And that's what we did. Over the good paying factory job that George Floyd should have had, right? Or at least had access to, got shipped over in the late 90s, early 2000s, in the 2010s, it got shipped to China. That's why he never really had a shot to make a living where he could really support anything. And that's the history of our nation. We shipped, I think, 4.5 million high-paying high-paying manufacturing jobs. And remember, every manufacturing job comes with, the coffee shops around it, the restaurants around it, all the other services. You take out 4 million high-paying manufacturing jobs and ship it all over. And here's the thing, the Greek tragedy part of it, because in Greek tragedy, the hero's greatest strength is also his greatest weakness. That was all done on the money of the working class and middle class, okay? Your pension funds, the insurance companies, your tax dollars, all went, you basically paid for your own destruction and the destruction of your children and grandchildren. That's the great crime here. That's the crime of our elites. That's what's got my burning hate of these people, that they have used the actual money and retirement and pension money to ship the jobs overseas, make their own money, skim it off the top, and send the George Floyds of the world to foreign battlefields to basically die to support the neoliberal neocon system. And that is what is the great tragedy of the American people. That's what we've supported. And by the way, this is what the great awakening in the Republican Party and on the populist right is that what Donald Trump was, we came through with a whole new vision. This is the way you really got to look at the world. Don't look at the way that the media, including Fox News, is trying to show you, because that's a sucker's play. All Fox News is the center-right version of the neoliberal con order that the New York Times and MSNBC and CNN is the center left. And all they want you to do is divide you on these things that at the end of the day don't make any difference. What makes a difference is capital and money and jobs. And because once you sort that out, the rest of the stuff falls in place, right? The rest of the stuff falls in place. It's the reason, Ice Cube has had this plan that President Trump worked on and Jeff Quattin has worked on. They're so dedicated, which has been my thing. They want it's a system to basically get $500 billion of capital into the black community. Because I keep saying you can have all these jobs for you, do all this stuff, it's all marginal. You get capital into the black community, and it'll sort itself
Absolutely.
out. They're great entrepreneurs. By the way, you're going to have failures. You have failures everywhere. But the entrepreneurial spirit of the African American community will figure it out. They will figure it out. But you got to get access to not just bank lending, you got access to private equity, venture capital. That if you do that, yes, you're going to definitely have some failures. There's no doubt. There's going to be a lot of zeros that go zero, but you're going to have more successes, and you're going to build generation after generation of entrepreneurs that know how to use capital and put it to work. And so I think that this is the system that right now the system's totally upside down. We have a greater concentration of wealth than Obama, because what happened, the CCP virus, and then basically some decisions were made. Now we have right now we're sitting on a system that under 1% of the citizens of this country control more wealth than 90%. And you got to remember, if the revolutionary generation came back, and look, some of those individuals were slaveholders, given the society they came from, they were all white men. But if they came back today, they would spit on the floor about what we've allowed this to happen to this country, because they would say, and hang on, we put our lives on the line to break free from a landed aristocracy and monopolistic mercantilist capital as provided by the British East India Company. Remember, John Hancock and Sam Adams, these guys, they were smugglers. Their job was freebooters. They were going around the system to say, the system doesn't work for me. I'm not buying into the crown skimming 20% off the top or giving a letter
no to economic imperialism. Say no. Say no.
And what we've allowed in this country is a sin. We've allowed a system of oligarchs, both on Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and in the corporatists, global corporatists, to control the nation, not the working class people. And this is also, I think, the great failure of Bernie Sanders and the populist left. It's been nothing but a pillow fight.
Well, yeah.
They had 2 shots to take on Hillary Clinton. I am very proud of the fact that when I stepped into the campaign with, basically 90 days to go in 2016, when Trump was pretty far behind, is that I was brought in for one reason. I had spent years studying the Clintons and putting the wood to them at Breitbart. I knew exactly what their weaknesses were as globalists. I knew exactly what their weaknesses were as defender of the neoliberal neocon order. And Trump's campaign, where it changed, was to take the heat, take the torch to the enemy, show the country of what she stood for. And I knew that working class Democrats and independents in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Iowa, the upper Midwest, that we could pierce the blue wall, which we did.
And this is not only have they created this economic Ponzi scheme to fatten their own pockets, but the really frustrating thing for me as a young black man growing up in this country and kind of watching this whole thing take place and becoming aware of it, the really scary and frustrating part is that they've gotten black people or all disenfranchised working class serfs, as we would now rightly identify them. They've gotten them all to believe that they're doing these things in their interest. I mean, that's kind of the next evolution of this whole Ponzi scheme is you're disenfranchised. There's no way for you to move. Now we have to go to these elaborate fourth industrial revolution sort of tactics with tech and digitalization, automation to create new jobs for you or new ways to basically be poor and have no meaning in your life, which is like virtual reality and porn and all these other things.
But this is why I'm such a strong, I've been such a strong advocate of restrictive immigration policies, not just on the southern border, which clearly is an invasion,
doubt.
and it's there to, and it's just destroying the black working class and Hispanic working class and they brag about it. I mean, the Biden and these guys don't hide it. I mean, the Fed talks about it all the time. They have to bring down wages. Like I said, the biggest problem we have in the country is wages of black Americans and working class Hispanics. That's the number one problem. They make it the number one problem. And this system, they brag about the fact they got 1 million illegal aliens that came through this gamed asylum system in the workforce, including, as the New York Times shows last week, 130,000 kids of essentially indentured servants, quasi-slave labor. They're proud of it because they bring down the wages. They want to. I'm restricted, though, not just on illegal immigration. The thing Steve Cortez and I claim in Navarro, we want no immigration whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I keep saying until African Americans and Hispanics, not with any affirmative action program, but just start restricting labor until they are 10% or 15% or 20% of Silicon Valley, of the high value added jobs in this country. Why are we importing the world thing? Because
the Nancy Pelosi, but you gotta remember the Nancy Pelosi's and the AOC's and the Joy-Ann Reids of the world say that the blacks and Hispanics can't do those jobs. They're not qualified. They're not trained. They can't be trained. They're monkeys. They're deplorables. They're exactly what Hillary Clinton would have called the broader echelon of working class, humble, common folks in this country.
In so many words, by their policies, they absolutely believe that. They believe that they're smart. I keep saying no. I don't think the African community, American community, is not as smart as the rest of the world. I don't think Hispanic community. What I think is that you have these STEM. You've turned education before they got into all the grooming. You took history out. You took art out. You took everything out to make it STEM: science, technology, engineering, and math to pass the schools. But then you don't have any minority. You don't have blacks in the engineering schools. We have to get access to the engineering schools. Why don't you have access to the engineering schools? It's not because blacks and Hispanics are any dumber or don't, because the schools understand the scam. The in-state students come at $15,000 and the international students come at $55,000 or $60,000, and that vigorish helps to perpetuate the system. So you go to the engineering schools and it's all foreign students. I have no problem with foreign students whatsoever. But I want to see American citizens in those engineering schools, because engineering schools are then going to, and IT are then going to lead to high value added productive jobs. The system, and here's the crazy thing, is that and I do think you're seeing a definite awakening among African American men and Hispanic men. They overwhelmingly vote for the system that's enslaving them.
No doubt.
There is no possibility.
Well, put it this way, Steve. Put it this way. You could also think of it this way. They view American citizenship and the history of American citizenship as a revolving door. They have no beginning and no end on it. It's just one perpetual timeline. And in that perpetual timeline, they use the excuse or justification that you often hear, in the Twitter echo chambers of the left or on MSNBC that, well, this whole country was founded on immigration. So that means we should have unlimited immigration at all times and forever. No, there was a moment in history that you could rightfully mark and say, okay, now we're a nation. Now we're a full nation. We've hit a carrying capacity. We've hit a relative carrying capacity. And in this spot, we need to protect the value of our citizenship by not expanding beyond our means. That's what conservatism rightfully aimed to be, that we completely got lost and sidetracked on. But
if anybody gives you the pitch, anybody, Paul Ryan, with these guys saying, oh, America's an idea and we're a nation of immigrants, here's your response. Go fuck yourself. We're a nation of citizens. We've always been a nation of citizens.
That's right.
And the American citizens have put it on their back. And remember, I want to make sure, because I know we've got a short time here. I want to go back to something to make sure, because they talk about America and everything. One of the things they talk about is the capital markets and the money that comes here in the stock market and the bond market, everything like that. And I keep telling people, I said, well, listen, this is the same problem we had in the environment back in the 50s and 60s, called the tragedy of the commons. I said, the air in LA was dirty, the water was, you couldn't, the Hudson River, you could walk across the East River, because nobody, and when you had these laws, the Water Act and the Air Act, then you started to put a price on effluent, because they weren't charging for the full capitalist system. That you didn't really charge for dumping the stuff, right? You charged, for labor and for supplies and stocks and, all the things that went into manufacturing, but you never had to, it was free because you're just dumping it into Love Canal, or you're just dumping it into the Hudson River, into the air. Once you got laws in there that actually put a cost and a charge onto fully loading what the effluent was, you then the environment started to kind of heal itself, because you stopped putting so much bad stuff in the environment. Same thing here. When people talk about our capital markets, robust economy, I go, well, hang on, why is that? It's not that our stock exchange or everything, it's not that we have better regulatory things, it's not the SEC's that much better, all these agencies that much better. They are marginally better, but it's not the core of it. The reason people put their money, and they want to put their money in the United States of America, is the stability of the United States of America. And that stability is based upon Edmund Burke's Little Platoons. It's the guy that coaches Little League. It's the housewife that also, helps run the Girl Scouts. It's the churches. It's the schools. It is those little villages, and even in the big cities of Chicago and New York, because they're all made up of little villages, the little neighborhoods. That is the underpinning of the security of America. That is the foundational element. And quite frankly, it's like in the old days, it gets zero value. They get zero value from the system. In fact, the system's totally predicated. It's built on your shoulders. They tax you to death.
Serfdom.
You're basically, working class America is a nation of serfs right now, particularly under 40. If you're in the boomers, you've had a shot with the great expansion in the 50s and 60s to basically buy something and maybe get a stakehold. But if you're under 40 years old, you're screwed. And as most people vote Democratic and vote for the neoliberal neocon order, no matter what Bernie Sanders is telling you, and they're going to throw you a tip every now and again, they're going to give you Obamacare insurance, or they're going to give you the $15 wage. That's all a world wrestling thing down the bottom for you to grab onto, or all the stuff you see on MSNBC or Fox News every night. That's all to distract you. There's a French poet I quote all the time named Piget, who died in Verdun in the very early days of the war, but he's a French poet, and he said, the most important thing in your life is not to come back and to report what you see, right, to your family, your friends, or even to yourself. The most important thing in your life is to see what you see. Really understand that. And that's where we are today, that people are very distracted and kind of lose the plot. And that's why I'm a populist and nationalist, and that's why I know our movement is ascendant.
Absolutely.
People say, how can you be so optimistic, everything like that? I said, because we're winning. Do we win every election? Do we win every policy? No. We have the administrative state, we have the globalist neoliberal neocon order, but it's collapsing around us. It's collapsing. Here's why. If you don't comply, it has to fall, because it's on your shoulders. The tragic part of this, it's built on your shoulders. All you have to do is throw off your change. You have to throw off your indentured servitude to the system and join the populist movement in this country.
And the truth is on our side also, and that's the other thing, is that what people who have really abnegated their faith in God, or really their humanity, their true sense of humanity, what they really fail to realize is that the short-term gratification that is satisfied when you give a person dopamine or serotonin or technology or porn, there's a deep yearning that God put there for all of us, the Creator put there for all of us, that wants more, that wants a different version of freedom, even if those things are as great as they possibly be. That's why you see a bunch of rich people, and I'm sure you saw plenty of them on Wall Street, who had $20 million homes, but they had something missing. Well, if the radical materialism actually makes you content in the end, then the most richest people would all be happy. We know that it doesn't work that way. It's the little guy who has a common life, an agrarian nation of shopkeepers, like our founding fathers intended this country to be, that really wins the day. But before you go, I know you got to run because you're a busy man, one of the busiest men in the whole game. But before you go, my fans would absolutely just abandon ship if I did not ask you about Russia and Ukraine briefly, because there seems to be a few new cultural narratives that are intended to maintain and preserve a corrupt status quo. One of them is WWE politics with race and culture and gender and this whole deal. The other one is climate. But you got the war machine, the neocon, neoliberal order cranking back up, winding up, getting ready to try and take over Russia. I said it on your show of about a month back. Every couple of 100 years, you always get some jerk off who thinks they can conquer Russia, and so now we're on the same trajectory with the European monarchies that has happened across history. And obviously you were in the Trump administration, so you were able to see some of the relationships or the relations between us and Russia under President Trump, which were much less volatile and much more stable. Give us your take on the neoliberal, neocon order and the ramp up to try and fight Russia. I see they're saying they want to take back Crimea. They're willing to, go all out to take back Crimea, which is a herald of World War III, to go really kinetic, really quick. What's your take on Ukraine and Russia before we head out?
This is a on the Eurasian landmass, we should only have one focus, and that is taking down the Chinese, assisting Lao Beijing, old hunter names, in taking down the Chinese Communist Party. And we should do that in a non-kinetic way. We don't need my beloved Seventh Fleet or the U.S. Marines or the Air Force or anything to take down the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party would collapse from the turn, since we basically gave them China in the late 1940s by backing them and not really backing Chiang Kai-shek. And this is because of the communists in the State Department and other parts of the government. But and then supporting them in 1989 when the people in China would have overthrown them, but having their back. So because we wanted to use their labor to generate profits for the West and for the criminals in Beijing. That should be our sole focus. Right now, we are sucked into something that the greatest military minds of that short 20th century, from 1914 to 1989, and I'm talking about Field Marshal Montgomery, I'm talking about George Patton, Eisenhower, even Churchill himself, who was always fascinated by the Balkans and Gallipoli and Turkey and all that. There was absolutely an ironclad law that we would never get involved in a war that deep into the Eurasian landmass, basically what's called the Bloodlands. Because in World War II, this is even World War I, but World War II particularly, this is where the mass casualties came from. These are Slavic people. They're fighting a border war about two Slavic entities. They've been fighting for 5,000 years, and leaving transhumanism aside, they will fight 5,000 years in the future. This is not our fight. We are not a European power, okay? This is the great scam of the white Atlanticist.
The Atlantic Charter.
Atlantic Charter and talking about the NATO and everything like that. No, we are a Pacific power. The Manifest Destiny took us to the ends of the made us a continental power. I realize Manifest Destiny, oh my God, Bannon's going there. We're a Pacific power. We have a place in the Pacific. And we bring order into the Pacific. The Chinese Communist Party brings disorder. The elites in our country are obsessed with Russia. And I think there's many different reasons that we don't have time for it today. And I'll gladly come back. But Ukraine is their vehicle to be a proxy for that. And we are being led down the primrose path. And quite frankly, for awakening Black men and Hispanic men, all you have to do is cut on MSNBC and CNN any night or read the Washington Post and New York Times. They lather up about this defense of Ukraine and what we're doing in a time when we have to cut trillions of dollars out of our budget in order to at one time get to a balanced budget, so we're not crushing working men and women with taxes and inflation out of control, and that we can finally get control of the Federal Reserve. All they want to do is put literally hundreds of billions of dollars in fighting a proxy war against Russia. And the way they're doing it is insane. We've essentially said, first off, we've killed 40 or 50,000, according to the Pentagon, women and children in Ukraine. It looks like a landscape of the moon. And one of the reasons is, Royce, because I know you're a student of history and you mentioned it earlier in this a few minutes ago, the Russians always have a bad first year or two, and they always come back. You know why? Because as a people, they just don't give up. And quite frankly, their leaders don't care how many bodies they have to kill in the charnel house. They're just going to keep coming at you with manpower. And that's what we've had here. This great tragedy in Ukraine is a tragedy of the Western powers using Ukraine and dangling out EU membership and NATO membership to have the Ukrainian people, who their valor and courage cannot be questioned. Of course. What they've done is extraordinary, but they're fighting over something that at the negotiating table is going to be negotiated. The Eastern-speaking border of Russian-speaking border of Ukraine is not in the national security interest of the United States, much less the vital national security interest. Our southern border is. Crimea, of which the Russians have had from time immemorial, right? With Yalta and Sevastopol, they will never turn over. In fact, they'll go to tactical nuclear weapons. We are now in a discussion of giving arms and letting Zelensky kind of decide. Biden said however long they want to go for and however much it takes. Right now, we don't have the money, and I'm telling you, this shows you, remember, before any system, before like a comet dies out or something, it always sparks highest. And you're seeing that in the neoliberal side with the Federal Reserve. You're seeing that in Ukraine as it lightens up before it burns out into an ember. And I just hope it doesn't suck in the United States of America, because it's very dangerous. And African American men and Hispanic men ought to understand something. This economic system right now is grinding you up, and the bigger the federal budget gets, the federal deficit gets, the more the Federal Reserve prints money. Your work is devalued, your currency is devalued, your earnings are devalued, you fall farther and farther behind, and the more that the neocons expand into the battlefields of the Central Eurasian landmass, which the greatest military thinkers in the West have always said, that's verboten. You and your sons and your grandsons and daughters are going to be churned up in the battlefields over there and end up as war dead. So right now, that's why this is the most historic time, I think, in not just in modern American history. I think it's the most historic time in all of American history.
Well, no doubt. And, you know, part of me thinks that when you get this type of, what do you call it, prosperity, power gained on the back of corruption and kind of crony capitalism, you tend to lose that sense of humanity, and you're willing to sacrifice as many people, especially and certainly their wages, but physical people as well, in whatever pipe dream that you have. I don't even see it. These people know that they can't beat the Russians in a long-term war. So you have to think it's either to steal money in perpetuity, or they actually want to see the carnage of a nuclear holocaust or something that's really escalated in the kinetic, which is a dark and scary proposition.
Let me just say before closing, along those lines, is that there's something that bugs me about the Ukraine, because I can't figure it out on a Cartesian. It's so illogical. Yeah. And our involvement now with the Trump and the impeachment, there's something in the 2014, and then thinking about Mo's career, where she was going to go to Afghanistan for a second deployment, got shifted over to taking the 31 Abrams tanks. Mo was one of the logistics officers in 2014. Before they go, they already had it planned. I mean, in 2014, and not a conspiracy theorist. There's something so dark that, earlier today, 419-0. The House of Representatives voted to turn over the Director of National Intelligence, which the CIA and DIA report to turn over every shred of evidence that exists right now in the intelligence community on what happened on COVID-19. Everything they know has got to be declassified and turned over so the American people can see it. There's something going on in the Ukraine. I don't know if it's bioweapons labs. I don't know right now. But there's something that they're obviously not being straight with you, because it makes no sense. It's more illogical even in the way they're running the economy. No doubt. And remember, today, as we leave this show, it's playing Friday night. The second biggest bank failure in American history, took place today, with California regulators stepping in before federal regulators and shutting down the bank. The only bigger bank failure in our country's history happened in 2008. Okay. We are back to that, the insanity. And part of this was about government securities that bank owned that are blowing up in their face because of the Biden regime's economic policies and the Federal Reserves, of which, Royce, you've been one of the leaders and thought leaders in our country in exposing. The other part is this Ukraine war. In a time that we need to dramatically cut the federal budget, and people in this country don't have pensions, they don't have health
They
care.
don't have
We're paying
$500 cash.
They don't have we are paying $5 billion a month right now. We're putting in to pay the pensions and the health care of the Ukrainian people. It is insanity what's going on in Ukraine. There's something not right. I know we're going to get to the bottom of it, but just right now we have to say no more money to Ukraine.
Not a penny.
Absolutely not
Not
one
a penny there, not a penny for the debt ceiling. Well, Steve, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate the time. I know you're a busy man. We hope to see you again in the future. We appreciate you guys streaming the podcast on War Room's Getter.
Well, we stream it. We stream it now. I tell you what, we stream it for very practical reasons. We get a massive audience. You have a huge following in the War Room Posse. Every show's 25 or 35,000 people watching it live just on our system. We know you get all your other systems, and people love it. They can't get enough of it.
And I want to say thank you personally, because no matter what the mainstream media, I got a bunch of mainstream media headline stories here about how you're some far right-wing, white nationalist, racist, conspiracy theory, and the list goes on, a danger to freedom and democracy. You're one of the first people that really allowed me to have a national platform, and you put it in my ear early that I had the chance and the potential to contribute to this country and this nation in a great way, and I appreciate your leadership. You're a friend and a mentor and a comrade in this fight for freedom, and we look forward to tuning in the war.
You've already contributed in a great way.
Sir.
Your march in the George Floyd situation exposed the beating heart of what the problem is.
The Fed.
And that's how you went from a media darling to like, hey, this guy could be dangerous because he's actually a smart guy. He's figured out the problem. Maybe we don't have him on TV anymore. That's the Federal Reserve, which is controlled by our elites and is one of the great metastasizing cancers in our nation's history. So, Royce, you've already, to me, made American history, and you're making a bigger contribution every day. So always glad to assist and be on the show. We love it. We watch it, and our audience absolutely loves it. And the reason is they're pretty good judges of what's meaningful or what's signal and what's noise. And that's where you have a big audience, because your show, and you're a serious person. You don't waste time chasing rabbits. And right now we're in the beginning stages of the Third World War. Serious people are going to survive this. Serious people could actually thrive in this, right? But you're going to have to get very serious, and you're going to have to really think things through. So I'm honored to be on here.
Thank you to the War Room. Thank you to MAGA, all of the nationalist populists out there. We look forward to watching you on the War Room every day. I appreciate it. And hello from my mother. She's a huge fan of the War Room as well. So,
well, we love your mom. She did pretty good. She did a pretty good job raising you, because you're a true warrior and a good man.
Brother. The fight continues. Godspeed to you.